Project on Ethics in Political Communication at the George Washington University. I'm an associate professor. I teach classes in strategic communication, rhetoric, language, things like that. And I'm also a strategic communications consultant. And I come at this work after 25 or so years working in senior positions in strategic communications in and around Congress, in the House, in the Senate, in the Obama administration, and organizations, consulting, lobbying, that whole range of things. And I'm going to throw some stuff in the chat that gives a bit more detailed links for those people who want to chase links. But the short version is that I launched the project 2 years ago to promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. Seems like it should be a thing. The question on the table for the project is, what, if any, ethical responsibility do advocates have, and to whom or what do they have them? And I don't ask lightly. I ask because after a couple of decades of this, I really don't know. My standing joke with my students at GW is that if I taught at Georgetown, it'd be easy. We would debate all semester, and in the end, the Jesuits would win. I don't teach at Georgetown, I teach at George Washington, and the Jesuits might be wrong. So I sort of leave students to their own devices. With that, a couple of other caveats before we get into the discussion. The first is that not only am I not going to define ethics, I'm also not going to define political communication. Most politics, most of the time, isn't candidates, right? We tend to think of candidates when we think of political communication. We've got a really interesting governor's race in Massachusetts, for example. Obviously, the 2020 election, races for the House, you got the mayor's race in Boston is going to be very interesting. But most of politics, most of the time, isn't that. It's the World Wildlife Fund trying to, get you to donate to save a polar bear, or it's the NRA trying to get you to call your state legislator or your member of Congress, or it's advocacy in a public square, right? It's sort of how do we engage a public dialogue to make our society or community better, to divide up the stuff. And really, if you have to ask whether or not what you're doing is ethical because it isn't technically political communication, you probably ought not be doing it. The next caveat I want to put out there is that I'm not just talking about don't lie and don't break the law. Don't lie and don't break the law. If that were all there was to it, this would be a very short conversation, and there wouldn't be a need for things like ethics. In my experience, that's not where the ethical challenges fall. And they also don't tend to be the big blows. They don't tend to be the big decisions, right? Very few of us get up in the morning and think, I could be a good, honest, ethical, good person, or I could kick a puppy and steal a COVID vaccine from an old person. Most of us get up every day and think we're doing the right thing for the right reasons, right? And it's those challenges, it's those things we're not noticing. It's those little bits of sand in the shoe. It's the, yeah, but the stakes are so high, we've got to do it this time. Or yeah, that's close enough to being accurate. Or I'll fight that battle on Monday, or we'll fix it on the back end. Those are the bits that tend to be the most challenging. I spent a long time doing this stuff for organizations and people you've heard of, and a lot you haven't. And in my experience, there isn't a whole lot of, straight up money for favors, right? I spent part of 2016 flying around the country with a commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, including time at the Kennedy School and the academic medical complexes in Boston and, all over the place. And at no point did a medical device industry executive come up to me and say, thanks so much for coming out. It's great that the commissioner is here. Now we've got a device stuck in the FDA system. If you could just take another look at it, that would be great. I'm not asking you to do anything untoward. That would be wrong. But is that your Gucci bag of cash you accidentally left in the corner? If that had happened, let's be honest, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you now. And if I were, I wouldn't be doing it from Washington, D.C. I'd be doing it from a boat off the Caymans or something. That typically isn't how it goes. It happens sometimes. I had a graduate student at GW who had been a lawyer, and he worked in the government ethics office in Washington, D.C. This explains why he was in grad school to do something else. And I sort of get that standard riff that, nobody's ever offered me money for access for votes. And he pointed out that when he was working for the D.C. government, he actually helped prosecute somebody who'd accepted $50,000 in cash in a coffee cup. My immediate question was the same as yours. How big was that cup? Because 50,000, that's a lot of dollars. Like, is this a big gulp thing going on? It's just, at any rate, it's the little stuff that's going to get you. We drown by degrees. So with that, I want to lay out a couple of strategic communications ethical challenges you might find yourself facing, and talk through some of the ways to think about them and some of the things to do next. And hopefully we're going to have a fair amount of time for discussion at the end. Just checking my clock. Any good strategic communications campaign has two key constituent elements, right? Strategy and tactics. You all know this. You're nice, smart HKS students. The strategy is the broader approach. The tactics are how you implement it, right? One great way to think about it was explained by an absolute rock star communications consultant here in Washington, D.C., who says, imagine that you've got a really rich uncle. Your uncle is just flat out bananas. Just, wow, are you kidding me? And is also near death. Your uncle has said he's going to leave all of his money to either you or your sister. And you've decided, you know what, ethics, I do that on the communication side, not on the how do I get my money side. So I want my uncle's money. You have a strategic choice. You can make yourself look good or your sister look bad. That's the strategic choice you make. The tactics are then how you implement that. If strategically you decided to help make yourself look good, you go to your uncle's house and you compliment him on his toenail collection, or the undervalued, nobody really appreciates the collection of magazine inserts that he's accumulated over the years, that sort of a thing. If strategically you decide to make your sister look bad, you're gonna go about how much she hates magazine inserts, right? You're just gonna run her down. So I wanna start with the strategy, which is where all good communications plans should start. Two of the most important strategic challenges you face are agenda setting and framing, right? Again, all of you know this. The most precious commodities any of us have are time and attention. While all of you are here, you could be doing something else. I can't see most of you. I assume most of you are doing something else. I don't know, going long on NFTs or trading Bitcoin or something like that. But time is zero sum, right? And if you're an advocate, you're asking for a piece of Susanna just turned on her camera to prove she's not trading Bitcoin, and she's gone again. I just assume the Bitcoin market's going well. But if you're here, you're not somewhere else. As an advocate, if you're asking someone to pay attention to your issue or your candidate or your cause, you're effectively saying something else matters less, right? Because you're all smart people. You're at the Harvard Kennedy School, right? This is a big deal to be there. You're very smart people. Your faculty are very smart. I know some of your faculty, right? Very smart, very accomplished people. And how clever must I be that I'm the guest who zooms in to talk about all this stuff? But in the real world, with apologies to A.A. Milne and Winnie the Pooh, we're all just bears with little brains. So as an advocate, you want a little tiny piece of my brain. You want to say, pay attention to vaccine distribution. If you say that, now I've got to think about something else less. World Wildlife Fund, the Arctic, the elections in Brazil. All right, now I'm thinking about the World Wildlife Fund, the Arctic, and Brazil, which means I've got no room at all to think about gun violence or transportation infrastructure or social security, right? You've got a limited agenda. So when you decide to work on something, you are making an ethical choice. You are saying this matters enough, not just for my time, but for Carolyn's time and Mo's time and Jeff's time and Moosey's time and everybody else's time. You can make a decision when you decide to be an advocate. You can choose to work on the big stuff that really matters or the little stuff you can solve or somewhere in between. Lisa Massimino, who's actually at the Carr Center at Harvard for a bit, used to run an organization called Human Rights First, wrote a chapter on a book I'm going to throw in the chat, where she talks about the ethics of agenda setting and framing. And she points out that the pressing issue of our time is climate. It is existential. If we don't fix climate, everyone dies. So we should all always be working on climate, except none of you are going to solve climate on your own. I know Ander, very good, very smart guy. I don't care how good and smart he is, he can't solve climate on his own. So there are other issues, though, on which Ander can work and he can solve. He can help solve. So should he be working on those? Because they're solvable. But if so, it's at the expense of. The choice usually isn't that stark, but the choice does happen, and this becomes an ethical decision. Just about a year ago, when the reality of COVID was hitting, a number of organizations, a lot of communications organizations came together and said, how do we talk about COVID? How do we talk about good public health behavior? How do we message it internally? How do you explain to students at Harvard or George Washington or Emerson College where I went, how to behave and what to do? The head of a major organization, it was a coalition of communications groups, said, whatever you are working on, the environment, criminal justice reform, whatever you are working on, stop. Because you're distracting from critical messaging around global public health. That's an ethical choice, right? And there's no right answer to that. The guy who runs the organization and I actually disagree about it, but know that when you're going into it, it's an ethical choice. How do you solve this ethical choice? We'll get to some of the solutions at the end, but a short-term ethical choice could be, as I'm working on this agenda item, can I bridge to something else? Right? I'm working on pandemic, but I'm really concerned about climate. Can you say one of the reasons the pandemic is as bad as it is because the climate is changing, we've got to account for climate change? Like, is there a way to bridge to this next agenda item? Right? Or there may be a time we have to say, you know, whatever I'm working on, I'm just going to be quiet for about 6 months. Right? Because we've got to deal with people getting vaccinated, people wearing masks. You know what, my issue is going to be around in a year or in 6 months. So I'm just going to be quiet and let others step up. Right? So that's the first ethical choice. Second, it's trickier, and that's the issue of framing. Again, just doing a quick time check. I'm both a college professor and a political hack. I can talk for 2.5 hours about anything. So if I don't keep track of my own time, woo. All right, so the second big ethical question we've got is framing. Again, bears with little brains, smart, cleverer than most bears with little brains. Like, I didn't say this when I spoke at Yale, but just at Harvard, you people are special. Nevertheless, you've got cognitive limits. We've all got cognitive limits. We also tend to encounter issues in one dimension at a time, right? Issues are multidimensional, right? Climate change is about the economy, it's about human rights, it's about environmental degradation, it's about pollution, it's about racism, it's about a bazillion things. We can't think about them all at once. A good strategic communicator, we tend to come into issues because of the way we come into them, right? For me, I'm an environmentalist, it's an environmental issue. For me, I'm worried about global trade, I'm coming at it from a trade perspective. I'm an economist, I'm coming at it from an economist perspective. If you're a smart strategic thinker, you care less about what you think, and you care more about what the people you have to persuade thinks, right? Persuasion is about the audience, it's not about you. Who can make the decision? Who can write the check? Who can cast the vote? Who can, you know, do the walking to work rather than drive into work? Whatever it is, who's that? Great. How do they view the issue? We're going to frame the issue in a way that makes sense to them. That's a basic strategic communications approach. Roots in Aristotle. You find traces of it in Kenneth Burke, certainly George Lakoff and other framing work. You don't have to believe Lakoff's sort of what happens in the brain processing piece, understand the power of metaphors. Frank Luntz talks about this. If you're a political science nerd, it's going to be Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones. Framing, right? Schachtschneider, it's the definition of terms is the supreme instrument of power. It's a phrase all of you have run across at one point or another in your academic lives, right? So it's a strategic choice. It's also an ethical choice. Let me give you a couple of examples to explain how this plays out. Again, same person who gave the terrific example about the crazy uncle uses another example to talk about framing. Imagine there's a city with an airport on the water, Logan, San Francisco, some other place like that. And they want to expand the airport, right? They want to bring in more passengers, more flights. That means more jobs. That means more economic development. It means all sorts of things, good for the economy. A group of environmentalists comes to a communications consultant and says, we got to stop this runway. There's an endangered frog that's going to be put at risk by expanding this runway. We've got to stop the runway to save the frog. As a good strategic communications consultant, you're going to think to yourself, you know what? Everybody who cares that much about frogs is in this room. What else is it about? Well, if you expand the runway for an airport, you're going to increase traffic. Passengers coming and going, Uber, Lyft, cabs coming and going, people who work at the airport coming and going. You're going to make traffic worse. You're all theoretically, hypothetically, even possibly actually in Cambridge. Driving through Cambridge and Boston is terrible, right? If it's economic development versus frogs, economic development wins. If it's economic development versus traffic, on the other hand. So you go with traffic to stop the airport development because that's going to be what's more compelling. Makes sense, except it's at the expense of a conversation about the environment. Because maybe the frog doesn't matter. I mean, the frog matters. I'm kind of frog ambivalent, to be honest. But it is critical that we talk about the environment and species and different ways in which they matter in the world. So we're forestalling that conversation. That's an ethical choice. A couple of other more real world examples that implicate me pretty directly. So one of the things I did for a while was work on anti-death penalty efforts. Right until about 1999 or 2000, the death penalty debate in America was whether or not people like Jeffrey Dahmer deserve to live. If you rape and murder children and hack them up and store them in your freezer, do you deserve to live? And if that's the question, the answer is we have the death penalty. And for hundreds of years, the debate against the death penalty had been the same. And the moment I said death penalty, a bunch of you went, oh, he's one of those. And a bunch of you went, oh, he's one of those. Nothing I'm going to say is going to change your mind. Right? It's a position from which we reason rather than to which we reason. So in about 1999 or 2000, a number of advocates decided to talk about something else. They wanted to reframe the debate. And I was one of these advocates, so I know this debate up close and personal. And the argument was, we don't care what you think about the death penalty, but everybody agrees that we shouldn't punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. Innocent people shouldn't be on death row. If there's DNA testing, which was just sort of coming into its fore, we should test DNA, right? And they pointed to examples of lawyers in Texas sleeping through trials. In Georgia, there's a prosecutor who referred to his own client with a racial epithet. So I don't care what you think about the death penalty, but we all agree everybody deserves a fair day in court. That worked. President Bush signed important legislation the Saturday before his re-election, actually. It was really pretty progressive criminal justice legislation. Massachusetts is one of a number of states that's abolished the death penalty. Most recently, Virginia abolished the death penalty. New York, New Jersey, Illinois, New Mexico, and others. The Supreme Court has ruled against the death penalty in important cases. Right? Because the issue is now about fair trials and innocence, not about aggressively, intentionally, deliberately, not about race, not about class, not about morality, not about ethics, not about any of those more complicated issues. So in not talking about the carceral state, and not talking about race, and not talking about any of those things, we forestalled critical conversations. And as we do this, there are people in Minneapolis arguing over the fate of the police officer who killed George Floyd. So we won the death penalty debate, but at what cost? That was an ethical decision, right? Similarly, I'm not going to burden it with other ethical decisions, with an eye to the clock. So as you think about framing your issue, you think strategically, but also have a piece in the back of your mind saying, what am I leaving out? Because every inclusion excludes, right? So what's being excluded? Who's being excluded? And again, either decide the trade-off is worth it, which is what we did with the death penalty. And I think we were right, but I'm certainly open to debate, and I'm not going to, follow my sword over it. And then also, are there ways to bring it in? Are there ways to say, you know what, it doesn't work? Plus, hey, let's talk about whether or not the state ought to be in the business of killing its own citizens. Hey, while we're here talking about fair trials, you think they're really bad here? Let's look at how bad they are and for whom. Now we can begin to have the conversation about race. Can you use one frame to set up the next frame or set up the next argument? Right? Think about what you're leaving out, write it down, and decide, yeah, it's worth it, or you know what, I can bridge to it. Or decide it's not worth it and I need to find another way. And I had a similar conversation like this with an international organization, one of the staffers of whom happens to run a different organization who is a client of mine. And we reframed an issue for her and said, hey, we won on the issue. And I used the issue as an example, knowing she was in the audience. And she said she thinks she made a mistake. We won. Her issue became part of Dodd-Frank. It became law. But she thinks, actually, on balance, wrong choice. So those are the strategic decisions. Now we get down to a series of tactical decisions, right? The implementation. And there are an infinite number of these. And again, all of us think we're doing the right thing for the right reasons. We're good people. We're saving polar bears or increasing individual rights or stopping climate change or improving education. Of course, we're the good guys. Of course, what we're doing is right and just and good. Well, probably. So here are a couple of ways that that plays out in tactics. One thing we all know is that stories are compelling. You've got to tell a story, right? Walter Fisher from the University of Southern California says that people aren't homo economicus, we're homo narrans. We're storytellers, right? We understand the world through stories. We make sense through the world of stories. We are bears with little brains. We make sense of this complicated weird world by saying, here's why this happened, here's why it's happening now, here's what happens next. As a victor, a victim, and a vanquished. You put a face on it, right? It's Aristotelian. It's ethos, pathos, and logos, right? Ethos is the individual story, or pathos is the individual story. It's the pulling on the heartstrings, right? Let me tell you the story about a young man from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. His family had been working the waters of the Eastern Shore of Maryland for decades. For as long as anybody can remember, they were working the waters of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Went to Catholic school as a track star. Joined the US military because they thought it was the right thing to do before going back in the family business, and he's gonna be a waterman like his parents. Well, he was arrested and sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. Only through luck and perseverance was he finally exonerated. The story gets longer, but we don't have a lot of time. The tragedy is he isn't alone. He's one of however many, right? You've got to have that story. It's the picture of the migrant child on the beach. It's the picture of the kid on the border. It's the picture in the papers today of children fleeing Honduras, looking for a better place to live, better way to be, right? The tragedy, one of the many parts of the tragedy of George Floyd is it isn't George Floyd, right? It's that we've seen this movie before, and too often this movie is played and no one's paid attention. But it's that story which grabs us. All right, so you got to tell a compelling story. And when you tell a compelling story, you got to pick which story you're going to tell. And you pick the story not based on what you think is most compelling, but what your audience thinks is most compelling. Right? When I was a kid, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. There's a hill. And there's a kid in our neighborhood whose parents apparently were just, I don't know, they were very nice, smart people. He's gone on to success, but you would never know this when he was a kid. And he used to skateboard down this hill. And I can imagine asking my mom, hey, can I skateboard down the hill? My mom would have said, why would you want to do that? Well, Nikki's skateboarding down the hill. My mother would have just laughed me out of the room. We've all been in this conversation with our parents. Well, if Nikki jumped off a bridge, right? If on the other hand, I'd had the wherewithal to say, well, actually, Mom, Harvard's giving out full rides to people who can skateboard down hills, my mother would have pushed me down that hill, right? You've got to pick the story that's going to resonate with the audience, which means you need to connect stories to them. Let's for a moment imagine that you want to get dreamers or DACA recipients to be able to stay in the US. You don't have to persuade me, in part because I don't matter. I'm a college professor. Nobody in Washington, D.C., I don't get a vote in Congress. Nobody gives a rat's what I think about this. You need Senator McConnell, Senator Cotton, Senator Hawley, Senator Collins. The problem with D.C. statehood is that everybody who likes it has no power. It's just this conundrum. It's also an evergreen topic in my strategic communications classes. 20-year-olds suddenly get outraged that they can't vote. Yeah, we told you that when you came here. At any rate, right? You need to persuade Senator McConnell of something. So you tell them a story that's going to resonate with Senator McConnell. Maybe the young girl who crossed the border alone, vulnerable, innocent. She was brought here by her parents when she didn't know any better. And she worked hard. She got good grades in school. She learned to have pride in America. Right? Maybe she lived in Kentucky. Maybe you found someone in Kentucky because that's where Senator McConnell is from. Maybe ideally from his town or a neighboring town or where he knows people. And this young woman got really good grades, doesn't speak a lick of Spanish. It wasn't spoken at home because her parents wanted to be sure she understood English and America and the American way. And she got a scholarship to go to the University of Kentucky, because that's, again, where Senator McConnell is from, and she's going to study medicine because she sees the problems and the traumas our country is facing and she wants to make us better. The problem with Senator McConnell is you want to send her to a country she's never been in, where young women are vulnerable, the schools aren't so good, and she won't be here to help America. That's a compelling story. It's a girl, it's suburban, it's Kentucky, it's full ride to study medicine, all of which may be true. I am certain there are people who do that. Not everybody does that though, right? They're young men. They're young men and women who don't want to go to college, who don't want to study medicine, who aren't from Kentucky, who don't live in the suburbs, who live in the cities. You're not telling their stories. So what you're effectively doing is saying, it's okay, Senator McConnell, to help people with whom you're comfortable, who look like you, or who look like your daughter or your granddaughters. That's a compelling choice. It's a more compelling story. But it comes with an ethical trade-off. Who are you leaving out? Consider also when you tell stories, who owns those stories? As a consultant, I made a pretty good living advising these organizations, right? This is my house behind me. That's kind of a cool thing. Everybody whose story I told, they don't get anything out of it. They're not getting paid. One of the guys, the death penalty story I told, he actually did get paid. He worked for me for a little while, which is a different set of ethical challenges, right? So think about that story. Who profits from that story? Whose story are you telling? Who's left out of that story? In solving the problem of immigration and DACA recipients, are you reinforcing a structure that says, you know what? Middle-class white people are just fine. It's everyone else who's the problem. That's problematic. Like, let's not reinforce and reinvent that story. So ethically, how do you do that? Again, it's about, is it worth it? Write it down. Is it worth a trade-off? Who's left out? Whose story isn't being told? And then how can you include the story? Say, you know what? This young woman isn't alone. Her brother is also in the same boat. And frankly, he's not as sharp as his sister is. He's struggling in high school. He might go to trade school, might go to community college. But like, what else, how else can you bridge it? Who else can you bring in? And when you tell these people stories, if you ask them to tell their stories, you're also asking them to be a prop. Because I can tell the story. Look, middle-class white guy telling another story about other people. Or you can ask them to tell the story. Much, much more compelling. So now you're a prop. Right? I'm asking a human being to be the means to my end. Those of you who are Kant fans, any Kant fans? I'm going to assume everybody whose face I can't see is a Kant fan. Woohoo! No, not so much. I'm an Aristotle guy, I'm not going to lie. But you're using people as a means to your end. Further, you're guaranteeing they're always going to be that person. If I take, I'm going to pick on Ander because he and I are friends. If I take a picture of Ander and say, here's a picture of Ander Caballero, tragedy's befallen him. Tragedy hasn't. Ander's got a pretty good life. But I put his face on, I put his picture on buses all over Boston. He's forever going to be that guy. Someone's going to come up to him at Fenway when we're allowed to go to Fenway, or the New England Revolution game when they're getting ready to lose to DC United, or whatever it happens to be, or when Athletic Bilbao finally comes to the US. And they're going to say, hey, I know you. You're that guy. Now imagine instead of Ander, somebody tied to the Kennedy School, it's a teenage boy or a teenage girl. It's a rape survivor. It's a victim of sexual violence. Now you're condemning that person forever to be that person. And you're not paying them for it either. That's a choice. You can help them make an enlightened choice. You can say, look, you need to know, like for the rest of your life, somebody's going to go, I know you. And it's not going to be because you wrote a bestseller or like you did a thing on TikTok. It's going to be because something awful happened to you. Similarly, if you say, well, then I'll pay them, I'll compensate them. You're now paying that person to relive the worst moment of their lives again and again and again. And I did this with Kirk Bloodsworth, who was the first person sentenced to death in the US who was exonerated because of DNA evidence. He was on my payroll. His job was to stand up and tell his story. Part of his story was that when he was in prison, he was resentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. His mom died, and he got to view her body while he was wearing shackles. As brutal as that is to hear, imagine saying that again and again and again for your job. We were pretty clear with Kirk what was going on. He knew what was going on. He's a grown-up. He wanted to help. We probably could have done I could have done a better job of saying, by the way, being a victim for a living is probably not good for your mental health. What else you got going on? can we find using help elsewhere? Again, ethical choice. Is the trade-off worth it? What else can you include? How can you mitigate it? Right, so those are stories, those are pictures. The two other things I want to raise and then open it up for a conversation are money and alliances. This stuff costs money, right? Consultants aren't free. I know this because I was one and people pay me. I still am one and people pay me. Lobbying firms cost $10, $15, $20, $25,000 a month. Public relations firms will cost you $5, $10, $25,000 a month. Good digital strategists make $80, $100, $150,000 a year. That money's got to come from somewhere, right? And it's coming from foundations, it's coming from wealthy donors, it's coming from direct mail, it's coming from email. You're raising the money, right? Whose money do you take? I'll take the good guy's money. Okay. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Where do you draw the line? A lot of, an alarming amount of social justice in this country is actually being done by the private sector, it turns out. And it's not just recent activities in Georgia. But Coca-Cola, for example, is a huge supporter of the World Wildlife Fund. Excuse me, and part of it is because the people at Coca-Cola actually legitimately care. I know the former comms director, the VP of comms, whatever that top job title is at Coca-Cola, and she legitimately really cares. She came out of the Carter administration, like she's an Atlanta liberal, she cares. The other reason Coca-Cola does this is because Coca-Cola believes in clean water good, right? You would solve a lot of public health problems globally if more people had more access to clean water. The other reason Coca-Cola likes clean water is because their product is bottled locally, and that requires clean water. So they'll promote clean water so that they have more access to the resources to make Sprite and Coca-Cola, which may not be the best thing for people around the world to be drinking. They brag on their, it's on the World Wildlife Fund website or the Coca-Cola website, I forget which one. They've developed a strain of sugarcane that consumes less water, because sugarcane, it turns out, is a water-intensive crop. Look, we're doing great. We're consuming less water in sugarcane. It seems like another solution would be to simply not grow sugarcane. Save all the water, maybe grow something else that doesn't, rot your teeth and lead to a global obesity challenge. So do you take Coca-Cola's money? World Wildlife Fund was a client of mine. I took their money indirectly. But again, it's an ethical choice, it's an ethical trade-off. You have to think on balance, you compartmentalize it, write down the advantages and disadvantages. It gets more complicated in the nonprofit sector or in the advocacy space, right? All of you have heard of Coke, not Coca-Cola, but the brothers. If you're conservative, they are the best thing ever because they're funding a lot of really interesting, thoughtful work in economics, in global trade, and across a host of issues. If you're a liberal, you hate them. If you're a liberal, you love George Soros, the Open Society Foundations, domestically and globally. If you're conservative, you hate them. One of the things that the Koch Foundation supports is civil discourse, open debate, First Amendment issues. I run the project in ethics and political communication at the George Washington University. Right now I do it, frankly, for fun. I get paid to be a GW professor. It's a thing. I don't have but if I struck out on my own, if I had to rent an office, I'd need money. Should I take Koch Foundation money? I like them on the civil discourse side. I think they're wrong on climate. I got to feed myself. I got to pay rent. If I got a staff working for me, then I got to pay them. I got to pay Carolyn and Allison and Cameron. Do I hang them out to dry because of my principles? So I say, you know what, Cameron's rent is less important than my ideals. Do I make that decision? The Koch brothers and Soros have gone in together on a project on foreign conflict and US involvement in wars globally. Is that an okay alliance? And again, I don't know. But know that, write down the advantages and disadvantages. What are the trade-offs? Can you make it without them? right? If you're hiring somebody, if you're hiring a staff, say, look, you got to know that these are the people we're not going to take any money from, which means your job is more tenuous. Or we're taking money from everybody. So just know the part of your rent is being paid by people you loathe. So they can all make just a more informed personal decision. Money is related to alliances. With whom do you partner? Right? We all heard the phrase, strange bedfellows. Works in DC, you get a left-right coalition. We're gonna get strange bedfellows. Because if everybody agrees with you, and you haven't won, that means you need more people to agree with you. You need to expand the debate. Political science undergraduates recognize that. I think that's Robert Dahl, I believe. Maybe not Dahl, doesn't matter. Look, the more people you have involved, the better. And if I need to involve more people, then I'm gonna do better. So, and again, you gotta figure out who do you have to talk to? Who do you have to persuade? Persuasion of the person you need to persuade. It's not about you. If a conservative Republican is going to be persuaded by a conservative group, do you bring the conservatives into the fray? Lisa Massimino, again, writes about this in the chapter. I am going to throw stuff in the chat, so if you're interested, you can get the book. She ran an organization called Human Rights First, which is sort of a medium-sized global human rights organization. And they were working on legislation to get asylum status for women who'd been the victims of violence globally. Just want to make this a category of people who were able to come to the US under special status. And the Republicans were in charge. They needed a lot of Republican support. They needed conservative support. And one of the groups with whom they agreed on this was a group called Concerned Women for America, very conservative organization. It has been run by women named Penny Nance. I've worked with her in the past. She's smart. She's great. She's like a good human being. Concerned Women for America and Human Rights First disagreed about global family planning. They disagreed about other immigration issues. They disagreed about a whole host of issues. But they agreed on this one narrow slice of asylum. Elisa made the decision to partner with Concerned Women for America to get the legislation passed, and it worked. In doing so, she elevated the voice of Concerned Women for America. She said, this is a group with credibility. She brought them into meetings with policymakers. She gave them attention. She said, this group matters. And that group, because it mattered a little bit more, would now be more successful at undermining the things that Elisa and Human Rights First cared about on the other side. On the criminal justice front, one of the ways we got anti-death penalty stuff advanced around the country was by creating alliances with law enforcement, victim family members, and prosecutors, right? Because the old death penalty debate was basically hippies and priests versus cops and victims. Now it's a little more complicated. So there's a group called Equal Justice USA out of New York. They're looking for a new executive director, by the way. If any of you have like 20 years of experience, shoot me a note. Also, you probably shouldn't be on this call. V, you're leading this conversation. They've had a lot of success, in part because they've worked with prosecutors and law enforcement, saying this is just a poor allocation of resources. The death penalty costs like a ton of money, and that's money that's not going to victim services, to cops on the beat, to other programs, and it's worked. But if you think the problem isn't the death penalty, if you think the problem is a system where we find more ways to inflict more retribution on more people, usually brown and black people, then maybe strengthening law enforcement isn't the way to do it. Maybe what you're doing in winning these debates is strengthening the system that forces this debate to happen to begin with. And I know this is a choice with which Equal Justice USA has wrestled over the years. You're making an ethical decision. It's not just about getting better your allies for this one time, not coming to my house for the Christmas party, but we're gonna do together. You're strengthening them, you're giving them attention, you're praising them, and you're reinforcing everything else they're doing. As Elisa Massimino writes in her chapter, if you don't wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat wondering whether or not you're making the right trade-offs, you're probably not in the game. Again, as advocates, write this down. Where are my lines? Which is my last piece of advice and where we're going to get, then I'm going to open the conversation. There's an infinite number of these things you're going to stumble across. The wrong time to make the decision is when rent is due, right? If I'm on the verge of having to tell Cameron, like, look, don't close in that house that you've been talking about. I know you're going to close it tomorrow. I need you to not do that. Or, oh, hey, some group I think is loathsome just came in with a truckload of money. Maybe I can tell Cameron to go ahead with his dream house. That's not the time to make the decision. as you are writing your strategic communications plan, write down, this is the money we will take, this is the money we won't take. These are the alliances, these are the hard lines on alliances. This is how we'll weigh. Not every group does different stuff, right? Like, don't say you're not going to not align with the US Chamber of Commerce and then discover you agree on things like immigration. Or, you know, I'm not going to align with Open Society Foundations and then find out you agree on speech issues or something. But like, these are the trade-offs we won't make. Write those down early, right? Every step of the way. As we move up the agenda, here's what's going to make us step forward and step back. Here's when we frame, here's where we're going to include and exclude. As we do this, we're going to set up the next conversation. Write that down, right? As you write your strategic communications campaign plans, from strategy to tactics, going this way, because I think this way in campaigns, not only are you going to write down what's my opposition, do I need a social media plan, who are going to be my advocates, who are my allies, who are my stakeholders, blah, 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 blah. Think about including this person, who am I excluding? And advancing this, what am I not advancing? And make that part of your planning process. And revisit it like you do every plan, but write that down. The last two pieces of advice are a little bit less practical, a little bit less HKS, and a little more metaphysical. This sort of more Department of Government, poli-sci, philosophy piece of it. This afternoon or this evening or tomorrow or this weekend or something, go for a walk and remind yourself why you're here. You're taking an hour out of an afternoon when you could be doing a lot of other things to think about ethics and advocacy. That means advocacy matters. That means you're in the world to make a difference in the world, right? You're not at the business school. You're not at the law school, right? You're not across the river at my alma mater studying television production or film production. You're advocates. Think about why. And it's not to win the next election. It's not to pass the next piece of legislation. It's because elections and legislation advance issues about which you care. Human rights, global rights, the environment, climate. Whatever the issue is, remind yourself why you got into that. And think about what your ethical foundation is. What's your touchstone? What is that metaphysical thing that guides you? I teach a course on ethics and political communication at GW. Yesterday, by the way, guest speaker, member of our faculty, we talked about media ethics. Not only is he an award-winning nonfiction author, wrote for the AP for 20 years, he also wrote the Black Panther book and just edited a compilation of Black Panther stories and has a Superman story coming out. So I don't care how cool you Harvard people think you are. I had a media ethics class taught by the guy who wrote Black Panther. At any rate, the final paper I assign my students is write down your ethical foundation. What's that thing? If you think, you know what, maybe this isn't quite right, what are you going to touch on? Answers I've had in the past have ranged from Horton Hears a Who from Dr. Seuss. And the student said, after a lot of reflection and thinking and wrestling with it, she decided she went into advocacy and wants to protect the environment because the environment can't speak for itself. So her touchstone is, am I speaking for those who otherwise wouldn't be heard? That's what I'm doing. Somebody else, I had another guest speaker come back who's now a rising star in the Republican Party as a Republican operative, walked through a series of bad decisions she made. And she said she was speaking with her grandfather, who's now who's since passed away. And he said, well, why didn't you just call me? So now for her, whenever she's in a tight spot, she imagines a conversation with her abuelo. I've had others talk about the Torah, the Old Testament. Like, what is that thing? Live with it. Right, make that a part of your routine. Right, one of the books over my shoulder is The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster, who recently died tragically. This is the copy that a friend of my family gave me in 1971, and it's been on my bedside or right here behind me for a decade, more than a decade. Because for me, this is it. It's a reminder to have good adventures worth having, to be balanced and reasoned and be kind and move forward. It's Milo. I had a firm called Milo Public Affairs, named for Milo in the Phantom Tollbooth. Write that down. Not Milo. I mean, you can, but the point is write down your thing. The next thing you need to do is much less prosaic. Write down the 3 or 4 things you won't do. What are the bright lines? I will not take money from blank. I will not lie with blank. If I'm going to work for a member of Congress, I will not work on these issues. Write it down and put it on a Post-it note or put it on a 3x5 card or a little tag on your computer, right? Put the Post-it note in front of you, put it on your bathroom mirror, put it in your wallet or your purse. Make it a pop-up window that shows up every now and again. Remind yourself all the time, right? We don't go to church because you forget between Monday and Sunday, what happened? Peter again, that name rings a bell. There was a, right, hang on, the gospel, what? No, it's because you need to remind yourself, what are these key lessons? What do we need to do? Write that down and put it up for you. And live with it. Right? So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for conversation, but I do want to just reinforce, there is, from my perspective, there is no right ethical answer. There are a lot of wrong ones. Mostly it's trade-offs. And I think the way you navigate those trade-offs more or less well is to think about them in advance, know that you're making trade-offs. As you make a decision, live with the decision, think, you know what, that was a good decision. Here's why, here's what made it a good decision. I'm going to carry that to my next decision. You know, I thought about who's left out of the picture. I've thought about what campaigns I'm bumping off the headlines. I thought about where I'm diverting money from. I thought tactically about ethics. Or if you look back and go, wow, as my former client did, you know what, that was not a good decision. Think about why. Right? Why was that win not worth it? How do I avoid doing that? Again, just as you do with strategic communications, right? Make ethics part of that grind. I'm going to stop ranting, and I would love to hear your thoughts while I dump something I've cut and pasted into the chat. What I'm putting in the chat is links to my email. Feel free to email me. I'm doing some work with the University of Texas at Austin, producing case studies on media ethics, strategic communication, political communication ethics. So like 2 pages long, well worth it. The Project on Ethics and Political Communications Twitter handle, a link to our website, and a link to the book. So where am I wrong? What did I get wrong? What questions do you have?